One of the most successful movie of 1989. What to talk about this movie? The entire nation is still humming the famous song, Oye, Oye.
I am an actor. I started acting in the year 1929 in the silent films. I kept a diary of my work, and now I'll take you on a little journey. This is my diary, my work. My first film was called Sparkling Youth. We used to have English titles for our pictures. It was an outdoor film made entirely on location, and it proved to be a success. I did about 11 silent films. The first camera I faced was a camera which was wooden and hand cranked, and even the magazines were wooden in there. And we did mostly social films and action films, and they were very popular. The number of theaters were less then, and when a silent film was projected, we had a commentator and a music, just a couple of musicians faking, you see, horse hooves and then fighting and things like that with a harmonium, as we call it, and a couple of drums. That used to be the background score for our silent films.
When I came into the film industry, it was a very different atmosphere altogether. To begin with, there were really no studios. There were little sheds here and there, and people worked in sunlight sometimes. And the whole thing was so absolutely, really uncomfortable. There were no dressing rooms, there were no sitting rooms, there was no canteen, there was nothing at all, no conditions of real conducive to making a good work or a good film or anything to that extent. We had a very difficult time because at that time, films were considered one of the lowest things of art. People never considered it as an art. They just thought it was a mambo jumbo of some sort, and that was that. So I came at that stage when film had no real standing or dignity or even the stability of a good financial background.
The film industry emerged at the same time as the mass movement for independence, in an atmosphere of intellectual and political ferment and cultural renewal. The pioneer of Indian cinema was D.G. Palke, an immensely cultured middle-class man who had already learned the language and potential of film by making documentaries. Influenced by the political climate of his time, Palke chose subjects which would boost nationalism and national pride. The mythical and religious stories he based his films upon found a vast and receptive audience.
The Indian cinema was very lucky to have a pioneer like D.G. Palke, who was a very aware person. He was a learned man. He was learned in the classics. He had a great knowledge of the theatrical traditions. He was also aware of the technique, not only of photography, in which he had studied, but also to some extent of cinema. Again, he showed a great shrewdness in selecting a subject which was known to the people. Now, in the silent days, it was a very important thing that if a story, especially in a country like India, where there was a large-scale illiteracy, if a story is known to the people, one didn't have to, they already knew the story of the film. So he picked up the subject, Raja Harishchandra, which was well known all over India, because people had knowledge of the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and this was a story from one of these epics.
It's true that Dada Saheb Phalke's Raja Harishchandra was the first story film, and which we called a long film. In those days, the films were half an hour to 45 minutes length. Harishchandra was a four-reeler feature, and the story is a man who fights for his principle, who doesn't want to succumb to any pressures or dictates, and who believes in a certain kind of integrity and conviction, and was prepared to sacrifice everything in his life, including his kingdom, his family, and sacrifice everything and take the biggest risk possible. So in the Indian context also, it is in terms of values, it upholds a very important value in our system, that we believe in a certain kind of integrity in especially in somebody is a leader or somebody who wants to consider oneself to be a leader of a group. So these values were very important at that time.
Cinema, an essentially modern but versatile medium, settled easily among even the most ancient of Indian performance traditions. It was a natural marriage, incorporating dance, music, storytelling, and symbolism. Cinema came to an audience already familiar with innumerable icons, popular drama, and the reenactment of spectacular myths, and it drew heavily on that culture. Audiences in rural areas were at first resistant to the cinema, superstitious and fearful of it, more so because Phalke understood the art and was a technical master of special effects. Well suited to visualizing otherworldly and fantastic stories that were familiar to the audience, his technique gave them an awesome and magical experience.
Indian cinema, right from its conception, has tried to synthesize these various diverse elements. It has tried to retain the native quality of the narratives, of the stories, of the preoccupations, while simultaneously synthesizing or taking elements from the various cinematic traditions that grew all over the world, whether it was German expressionism or Soviet montage or the Hollywood spectacle, or even European avant-garde films. All this somewhere managed to find its place in the churning pot that is called Indian cinema. And all these elements or influences were synthesized into a very original Indian form. The stories and the basic preoccupations of Indian cinema have changed over time according to the history and the social influences that were present at that point of time. Nationalism was really taking on as the major influencing factor, and therefore this urge for an identity, the search for an identity was the major issue or preoccupation of Indian cinema.
Gradually, as they entranced a mass audience, Palke and his contemporaries were able, albeit gently, to broach subjects of immediate social and political relevance.
The themes were not selected from the viewpoint of what was happening in the society at that time, because there are so much of interesting values inherent in our mythological stories, and they were picking up those episodes thinking that these values needs to be reinforced. One can always see the connection to George Méliès's work. And Falke had also, because he was interested in magic, and you know, I'm sure he must have seen the works of the films made by other filmmakers. Little influence is there, but the interest in magic definitely must have given him the idea of special effects. And also he could see in these mythological sequences wonderful possibilities of using the camera and doing tricks. The word used was tricks, not special effects at that time. Trick photography, like people flying and appearing and disappearing and things like that. So it's an extension of what in history of cinema, what Méliès did before, and Falke, with his religious background and with his magic interest, he evolved it in a most effective manner.
To the uninitiated, the first experience of film was not always comforting.
हमने कभी फिल्म देखी नहीं थी, रामलीला देखी थी। तो इत्तेफाक जब हम मेहमान गए थे किसी के घर, वो लोग उस रोज पिक्चर देखने जा रहे थे। तो हमने सोचा ये पिक्चर माने क्या होगा, रामलीला होगी। तो वो लोग हमको भी साथ लेकर के गए। तो जब हम थिएटर में गए और देखने लगे तो सब अंधेरा ही अंधेरा, और एक कर्टन आया ऐसा, तो उसके ऊपर लेटर्स थे और कभी गर्दन, कभी हाथ, कभी पाँव। हमने कहा इतने कटे हुए आदमी, ये कैसे? तो मुझे घबराहट हुई, तो मैं बाहर आई और मैंने कहा, वो एक आदमी था, मैंने पीछे की तरफ जाने की जगह कहाँ है? तो बोले कहाँ पीछे जाने का? तो वो वहाँ का वो ऑपरेटर था। तो उसने कहा कि ये नहीं, ये तो फोटोज़ है। मैंने कहा ऐसे कैसे फ़ोटोज़ होते? तुमको देखना का हो तो फलानी जगह जाओ। फिर हम वहाँ गए देखने के लिए। तो एक आदमी हटाते हटाते एक लकड़ी मारी तो मुझे लगी। तो वहाँ के जो प्रोड्यूसर थे उन्होंने पूछा, अरे तुम क्यों इधर आते, क्यों मरते हो? हमने कहा कि हमको ये आदमी देखने थे जिसके टुकड़े टुकड़े हो जाते, हमारे रामलीला में तो नहीं होता ऐसा, ये देखने के लिए आए। बोलते अच्छा रामलीला देखोगी, काम करोगी रामलीला में? मैंने कहा हाँ, क्योंकि 2 घंटे 3 घंटे में तो रामलीला होती थी हमारे तरफ। मुझे क्या पता किसी महीना 2 महीने 8 दिन लगते थे। तकरीबन अभी उस वक्त की जो फिल्में थी 8-10 दिन में पूरी हो जाती थी, क्योंकि डायरेक्ट पॉजिटिव पे बनती थी।
Well, Dadasaheb Phalke, who was our pioneer, the very first feature filmmaker in India, has said that he wanted to speak about the reality of the myths, what it means to us. In India, you would find that fairly illiterate people would also refer to our mythology with great ease. Quite natural that the mythological should form the base of the beginnings of Indian cinema. And it also renewed certain attitudes towards art. We are known for being worshippers of icons, no? And it has sort of continued that, in a sense, the relationship that we have to the image. The cinema has, in a sense, refined that and continued that tradition.
In a way, it was a blessing because it did a good deal to spread the cinema habit. It broke a kind of social barrier. Families could go and visit cinemas. Normally, they would not go, but once they knew that it was a religious performance, in a way, you know, Krishna Janama or Raja Harishchandra or Ram Banwas or anything based on epics, families would go and visit, the whole family. So in a way, it's helped the spread of cinema habit amongst the people and the growth of cinema in a way.
Palke always had a problem with the female roles in his films. No woman would dare appear in front of the camera, so men had to play the female roles. It was even a daring exception to cast his 7-year-old daughter in the role of Krishna.
At that time, the Indian folk theatre tradition, we had this problem of tremendous taboo attached to exposing oneself to a public audience, especially the women. And even in the folk theatre, the female roles were all done by the males. This is a long Indian tradition. So when film came, they couldn't, even though Falke tried his best to get female artists, but he couldn't succeed, and finally he has to follow the same pattern what was being done in the theatrical tradition. That means cast male actors to play female roles. And it worked very well, especially in that I would say that it created an extra dimension to, especially I still remember that the bathtub sequence where you have the males dressed like females and totally drenched, and which now looking now will give a kind of tremendous erotic feeling to the whole thing in terms of the image quality.
Although the fledgling industry remained a male preserve even as early as the silent era, a few women like Lalita Power tentatively began their careers.
मुश्किल तो औरतों को नहीं होता था, लेकिन मानते ही नहीं थे लोग. जैसे कि आपने देखा है नट लोग वगैरह होते, कोई रस्सी के ऊपर वैसे नाचते, नट नटनियाँ. इनमें उन आर्टिस्टों को गिना जाता था फिल्म के. या तमाशा होता था मराठी में, उस तरह का इज्जत ही नहीं थी कुछ. उन लोगों को ना तो मकान देते थे, ना बातचीत करते थे, ना फिल्म में कोई आदमी या औरतें आती नहीं थी. अगर फिल्म में काम करना हो औरत का, अगर समझ लीजिए कि कोई मॉब है और तो मर्द सब मॉब में चाहिए, तो औरतों को दाढ़ी मूछें लगाकर औरतें मर्द बना देते थे. या औरतें ज़्यादा चाहिए हो तो मर्दों को औरतों का मेकअप कर देते थे.
ये आपने देखा अपनी आंखों से?
देखा नहीं, किया है.
आपने मर्दों का भी रोल
किया है. दाढ़ी मूछें ऋषि वगैरह के रोल होते थे तो करना पड़ता था, क्योंकि परमानेंट जितने लोग थे वही काम करते थे और नहीं.
The silent films have come to an end amid protests and prejudices. It is the progress of times. The web of intoxication woven by the silent screen comes to an end. Where every man and every person lived in the world of dreams offered by silent films. It had a universal appeal. There was no barrier, no country which did not see a silent film, just because some did not know the language, and some were not singers. In the early talkies, most of our films were singing films, singing and talking films. And the old actors who used to work in silent films fell by the wayside, and the new breed from the stage came on to the films. And that was the beginning of the era of talkies in our country.
The first talkie was Salamara, which is, unfortunately, we do not have a copy of the film. It's completely gone, vanished. The idea came from the stage play. There are a lot of songs. In the Indian context, songs were very much an integral part of the stage play, because you tell a story not through dialogues and voice, but through songs and verses, which is very much a part of our tradition of storytelling.
नाशिवंत देह झाला तरी भंग तरी कीर्तन रंग सोडू नये विठ्ठल 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 विठ्ठल
A film about a saint, I mean, who was an ordinary man who was lifted to become a saint. Of course, this is a real-life character, and it is a folklore tradition in Maharashtra, and it's a very living legend. And even now, the film, whenever it is shown, it has its audience, and it definitely holds the interest.
Sound brought new storytelling possibilities, exemplified in the harsh realism of the Marathi film Sant Tukaram. But it brought new problems too.
पांडुरंग मनी पांडुरंग धनी आगला ते तुमच्या पांड्याला चला मंदी महिना झाला घरात पोर माशावानी तकपटले त्याचं काय आहे का तुमच्या जीवाला धनी पांडुरंग मनी घ्या या कारत्याला होय होय तेच मागापासून तुमच्या मोर वरडतो या त्याला का वशात विषात करायचं आहे का नाही
पांडुरंगासारखा गणपती आणि विठ्ठल नामासारखा औषध त्रिभुवनात तरी मिळेल काय तू पांडुरंगाचं नाव घे म्हणजे बरा दिसेल ना पांडुरंग पांडुरंग
खबरदार माझ्या जीवन जीव हसरून काढील त्या पांड्याचं नाव घेतलं तर घरातील एक येणा थोडं पुढे झालं
With the advent of talkie, several problems cropped up. Firstly, the problem of the language. Because earlier there was no language problem. Now we had in India especially 15, 16 languages. So cinema got fragmented. But at the same time, regional activity became more intense. Earlier, films were produced only in a few centers, but now the activities spread out into various other centers. Films began to acquire a definite character, original character, and that brought in a sense of, they gave it a kind of identity to the films. You know, a sense of realism was injected into the cinema.
Sound did a few things. It isolated people because of the language. That's the first thing sound did. Whether it's for good or for bad, I can't say. Even in our big country, we had different languages. So isolation was there. That's what the sound did for the first moment. So what was universal in our country, which would be available, I mean to say, interesting to all provinces, were mainly music and love stories.
इधर आओ खींचो इस रस्सी को
In an increasingly realistic medium, men could not continue in the female roles. But film acting was still not regarded as socially respectable.
बहुत बड़ा काम किया है तुमने. तुम्हें इनाम मिलना चाहिए.
Though social taboos prevented women from acting, there were a few who managed to defy the odds, and by so doing, gradually began changing public attitudes to women, not only in the cinema, but in the wider context of society and the community.
मिलने दे बेचारों को अपने बाल बच्चों से. तुम कौन? राजकुमारी की दासी. दासी.
The feeling that women should work in films was very, very much against the opinion of the public. They did not want women to go into that era of activity at all. They thought that it was something very below the below the dignity of a woman to act in films. And I had a lot of opposition. Not only that, I was ostracized by everybody, including my own family. Only my father felt that I was doing something out of the way, and he felt convinced that I had my convictions about this. Oh, it was terrible. It really was terrible. I'm not exaggerating. It was impossible to walk on the road without being insulted, without people making nasty remarks, about people saying stupid things which are silly. And only when the pictures became successful and when the characters depicted by the directors became successful to the appeal of the people, to the senses of the people, that my standard of the position in the industry went up.
Very interesting phenomenon in the Indian cinema. And this is very paradoxical. In fact, everything in India, I think, is a paradox. It's so many contradictions all living side by side. Now, this very interesting contradiction is about two trends. One is the sati trend, you know, Indian womanhood in terms of being a sati, and the other side of the Indian woman is Shakti. Shakti means strength. Now, as you know, in India, you have the goddess Durga, you have the goddess Kali. They are the goddesses of strength. And strangely, there was this one woman who dominated the Indian scene. I'm not talking of the Sati films, but this woman was Fearless Nadia. She was a stunt queen. She was known as Fearless, I mean, her title, her credit line said Fearless Nadia, and what a woman she was, is still, I think. And now, this woman alone battled with all the villains, with all the baddies, and I think she alone could put your Tarzan and James Bond and Rambo in the shade, you know. She battled all alone. She jumped off trains, she jumped off trucks, she jumped from buildings. I mean, she was incredible.
As the Indian cinema audiences and filmmakers developed the language of film, the political and social aspirations of both were expressed more clearly, particularly in the populist entertainment pictures. As elsewhere, filmmakers were drawn chiefly from the educated classes, and they were able to develop the language of this newfound mass media. Producers, writers, and directors of the popular action picture, fired by the rising tide of nationalism which was everywhere in Indian society, surreptitiously brought these issues to the mass audience.
Yes, that was his pet subject. He always used to put some messages. Always there was some message about unity of Hindu-Muslims or any of this subject. Then you see, that used to go, especially for independent India. They wanted that kind of underlying idea, because the censor was there. If we say anything against British, the pictures were censored. They didn't mind kissing, they didn't mind love scenes, they didn't mind anything. But anything against the British subjects or British ideas, censored. That is why. don't bring the Britishers, we bring the state people in it. And so as if that is the Britishers. And the people used to know that this is the Britishers.
चलो जल्दी भाग चले
30s I would consider to be one of the most interesting period of Indian cinema evolution. Immediately after the talkies came, there was an attempt to bring in people from other fields like theatre, literature, music, onto cinema. People working in theatre, stage, playwrights, and theatre artists who had a little more respectability, and musicians, and number of classical singers who have already earned a name in their own professional field were brought into cinema. So cinema got a certain amount of respectability.
Devdas, the story of a wealthy young man frustrated in love who turns to alcohol to drown his anguish, broke new ground with its anti-hero and its sense of despair. Unexpectedly, it had instant and massive appeal.
Devdas, क्या हुआ देवदास? बहुत तकलीफ आज धर्मदास आज क्या मैं पहुंच सकूंगा तो मत कल सुबह हम कलकत्ते पहुंच जाएंगे कलकत्ते नहीं मैं उसे दबान दे चुका हूं मैं जाऊंगा मैं जरूर जाऊंगा मैं उसके पास जाऊंगा अब क्या हाल है
क्या हुआ था
आपके हाथ से पूजा की सामग्री गिर गई थी
हाँ
You know, the theme is something which is of recurring interest because of the love interest and also the class difference. The film, in spite of the fact it was rather pessimistic and, it became a tremendous box office success, which really astonished a lot of film producers and distributors, Till that time, the concept was that you must have a happy ending and the hero and the heroine should live happily ever after.
एक वक्त ऐसा आया, ये 30s में आया है, जो इनकलाब आया फिल्म इंडस्ट्री में और ये बात फिल्म के शौकीनों को इसके लिए सुनने के काबिल है कि एक फिल्म आई जिसका नाम था देवदास, जिसने इनकलाब पैदा किया। वो सोशल फिल्म जिसको कहते हैं वहाँ से शुरू हुई और उस फिल्म ने हम लोगों को, फिल्म वालों को एक राह, एक लाइन, एक रास्ता बताया कि ऐसी फिल्में भी बन सकती हैं जिसमें लगे कि हम और आप अपने आप को देखें उस फिल्म में। वो सोशल फिल्म थी शरद चंद्र चटर्जी की लिखी हुई नावल देवदास, और उसने एक बहुत बड़ा सिंगर भी हमको दिया जिसको आज तक फरामोश नहीं कर सकी ये दुनिया, वो था के.एल. सहगल।
सावन आया तुम ना आए, सावन आया तुम ना आए, तुम बिन रसिया कुछ ना भाए, तुम बिन रसिया कुछ ना भाए, मन में मोरे हूँ कहीं उठत जब, मन में मोरे हूँ कहीं उठत जब, कोयल कूकत बन में बालम आए बड़ो।
social reform was an integral part of the nationalist message. This trend found expression through a variety of films of the 30s. Subjects such as the burning of widows, child marriage, alcoholism, and untouchability all came under scrutiny and were dramatically forced to the attention of the cinema-going public. Duniya Na Mane, which portrayed a young woman forced to marry an old widower, provoked a massive controversy and consequently enjoyed instant success.
देखिए अपने लड़की सुंदर है, शरीफ है.
She is actually tricked into a kind of marriage. First she is shown the son of that widowed man. She thinks she is going to marry the son, but finally when she is to put the mala, and she knows that she has been duped by an old uncle who wants to sell her off for money. Then the rest of the film is a very interesting struggle of this woman who doesn't take it lying down and fights for her rights. Normally the projection of the image of the woman in the Indian cinema has always been a sort of submissive, playing second fiddle to the husband, to the man, always there waiting for the husband to come back late night with his, so here is an image where she is assertive, she knows her rights, she wants to be independent, but somehow on the way the tradition comes and obstructs her desire to be too independent. And Shantapti, who plays this role of this woman, I must say, has done wonderful performance in creating this character. And even now, the film is topical in the sense that we rarely see the image of a woman who takes up that kind of injustice and fights it out till the end.
फिर खड़ा का खड़ा वही रे तेरे हाथ से ये नहीं होगा मैं ही दिखाती हूँ तमाशा हाँ रख दो छड़ी हाँ ये तुम क्या कर रहे हो
भगवान रक्षा करो
छोड़ो छोड़ो
Achyut Kanya dealt with one of the major evils of Indian society, untouchability, probably responding to the call of the national leaders. The story is of a Brahmin boy and an untouchable girl who are in love. But this love goes against the dictates of a rigid caste system.
आज के रसोई का सामान आटा, दाल, घी, चावल, नून।
ओहो, एक आना गांठ में है, पर रानी की ठस्सा इतना दिखलाती है, मानो सारी दुकान खरीद लेंगी। एक आने में क्या आएगा?
मैं क्या जानूं? तुम्हारी दुकान है, जो आए सो दे दो। मैं तो खाना बनाना जानती हूँ।
जी क्या कहने हैं? भला क्या-क्या बनाना जानती हो?
नहीं मानते तो बापू से पूछ लो।
हाँ जी, वो तो तुम्हारी से कहेंगे।
अच्छा तो प्रताप से जो पूछ लो, उसने भी तो मेरे हाथ का खाना खाया है।
प्रताप, ओ प्रताप, तैने कस्तूरी के हाथ का खाना खाया है?
ये खाना तो अच्छा बना लेती है माँ।
जो पूछती हूँ उसका जवाब दे। तैने इसके हाथ का खाना खाया या नहीं खाया?
खाया तो है माँ।
तेरी बुद्धि भ्रष्ट हो गई है। बामन का पूत हो कि इसके हाथ का खाता है?
बैलगाड़ी को हटाओ, डाक आ गई।
To overcome the difficulty of the subject matter, the writer of the film had to make her a sacrificial lamb, but with a dose of idealism. But why did she have to die?
An untouchable girl marrying a Brahmin boy, the Indian public didn't take it. So that's why they had to kill her by force.
As the growth of the mass market attracted bigger capital investment, film studios were started up in every major industrial city. The new studio system meant a more regular income for writers, artists, and technicians. And this, in turn, raised the quality of production.
ज़्यादातर जो आर्टिस्ट या टेक्नीशियंस थे वो स्टूडियो के परमानेंट मुलाजिम थे और जहाँ तक मेरा ख्याल है कि बैनर्स जो थे उन दिनों में वो सुप्रीम थे। लोग जो पिक्चर देखने जाते थे वो बैनर्स के नाम पे जाते थे, इंडिविजुअल आर्टिस्ट या डायरेक्टर के नाम पर भी नहीं जाते थे। उन दिनों में पैसा ज़रूर कम था लेकिन एक रूहानी तकसीम मिलती थी हम लोगों को।
बम्बे टाकीज अगर हिंदुस्तानी फिल्म इंडस्ट्री में देखा जाए तो उसका एक मकाम था, बहुत ऊंचा मकाम था। पूरा स्टूडियो ऐसा लगता था कि वो हिंदुस्तान में नहीं है। सारे तो खेल थे वहाँ, टोटल इंडोर आउटडोर दोनों, और सारी सहूलतें थी और ट्रेनिंग सेंटर था। यानी तो बम्बे टाकीज जैसी तो फिल्म कंपनी बनी नहीं है, 30 से पहले भी थी भी नहीं कोई, ना उसके बाद कोई हो सके।
In the 1930s, a screenwriter was called a munshi, or scribe, whose job, according to one famous writer, was to write shapeless scripts as the director desired. One man, Kamal Amrohi, changed all that, and by the force of his pen created an important place for the film writer. He got the credits for story, dialogue, and songs in an outstanding historical of 1939 called Pukar.
किसने पुकारा हमें? जहां पनाह। किसने जुल्म किया तुम पर? तुमने माँ बदौलत की रियाया के चैन पर हाथ डाला? तुमने हमारी हुकूमत की साख पर चोट की? तुमने एक इंसान का खून किया? तुम गर्दन मार देने के लायक हो। जो इंसान अखलाक के दायरे से निकल जाए उसे दुनिया की हद से भी बाहर निकल जाना चाहिए। तुम्हारे लिए हमारे इंसाफ ने सजाए मौत तजवीज की। शहंशाह रहम। तुम मुजरिम हो, तुम्हें सजा के सिवा और कुछ नहीं मिल सकता। आलीजा, मेरे बाद तुम्हारे बाद तुम्हारा अंजाम दुनिया के लिए सबक बनकर रहेगा। ये मेरे मासूम बच्चे, इनकी परवरिश शाही यतीम खाने में होगी। इन्हें एक मुजरिम बाप के साए में नहीं जीना चाहिए।
जहाँ पना एक कनीज बेवाह हुई जा रही है।
असल में उनको किसी ने आइडिया दिया था। आइडिया मेरा नहीं था, मैंने लिखा उसको। वो असल में शिबली नोमानी की एक पर्शियन नज़्म है, 15-16 शेर हैं वो, इंसाफ के ऊपर जहांगीर के, बड़ी मशहूर है वो। तो किसी ने उनको सजेस्ट किया कि आप वो बनवाइए, तो उनको मेरा ख्याल आया, तो उन्होंने मुझे बुलाया कि तुमने वो नज़्म पढ़ी है? मैंने कहा जी हाँ पढ़ी है। तुम फारसी जानते हो? मैंने कहा जानता हूँ। तो ये नज़्म है, इसे सुनाओ मुझे, क्या है ये? तो मैंने सुनाया उनको। कहने लगे इसे लिखना है, स्क्रिप्ट भी लिखना है तुम्हें। मैंने कहा बहुत अच्छा। तो मकसद उनका कहने का ये, वो ज़रा थोड़े से एम्बिशियस थे और चाहते थे बड़ी फिल्में बनाना, बड़े के लिए, और वो किया भी उन्होंने, बाद में बताई उन्होंने।
कि मलका नूरजहां ने तीर मार कर तुम्हारे
वो बन गई फिल्म, उस हिसाब से वो, यानी आमतौर पर 3 महीने में बनती थी, वो बन गई 10 महीने में। 45,000 में, 40,000 में फिल्म बनती थी, वो बनी 2,60,000 में। बड़ी महंगी फिल्म, बहुत फिल्म रिलीज हुई, और वो पहली फिल्म है जो 4 थिएटर में बम्बई में रिलीज हुई। मिनरवा, कृष्णा, सेंट्रल, और एक और था कोई, मैजेस्टिक, और बहुत ही ज़्यादा उसने हंगामा मचाया, यानी यहाँ तक कि उसको देखने के लिए अंधे आए कलकत्ता में।
Dialogue allowed the great writers of the day to reach a wide audience and attain tremendous popularity.
रानी, जिस तरह मलका ने तुम्हारे खामिन की जिंदगी पर तीर मारा है, उसी तरह तुम भी मलका के शौहर की जिंदगी में तीर चुभो।
शहंशाह, शहंशाह, आलम फना को मलका आलम ने पुकारा।
रानी, मारो तीर हमारे सीने में, खून का बदला खून, यही जहांगीर का इंसाफ है। इसी इंसाफ के बल पर हमारा खून बहा दो, हमें खून में डुबो दो, हमें हमारे ही कानून के शिकंजे में रख के पीस डालो, हमें हमारे ही इंसाफ पर कुर्बान कर डालो, हमारी ही लाश हमारे इंसाफ की ठोकरों में डाल दो, हमारे इंसाफ को आबे है आप पिला दो। तामील हो, तामील हो, तामील हो, तामील हो, तामील हो।
When the silent era ended, film lost a certain universal quality. Then a new universal element was discovered in the film song. Which quickly became an essential part of popular film language, an event which gave Indian film its unique narrative style, and which would also have far-reaching consequences for the popularity of the cinema itself.
हमारी जो पहली टॉकी फिल्म बनी थी वो 1931 में थी, और मैंने 39 में इंडस्ट्री ज्वाइन की, तो इसलिए ये हिंदुस्तान के लिए एक न्यू मीडियम था। So it was a very innocent age, less of commerce, more of devotion, not that much of art or technique. That's why there was a constant search to find new ways to use camera and sound. नए मेथड एडिटिंग के लिए सोचे जाते थे, और एक्टर जो हैं वो हमेशा अलर्ट रहते थे कि कुछ ना कुछ नया करके पब्लिक के ऊपर अपना इम्प्रेशन छोड़ जाएं। तो इस तरह से ये छोटा सा सिनेमा जो था, ये बढ़ते बढ़ते इतना बड़ा हो गया कि वर्ल्ड में इस वक्त हम सबसे ज़्यादा पिक्चरें बनाते हैं।